Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the first season of Riddlers, a podcast by Reflexive Lenses. I'm Pratibha, and with Reflexive Lenses Consulting, I'm on a quest to meet some truly intriguing riddlers, organizational leaders, HR consultants, and coaches who explore the complexity of human drama within systems. Each conversation is guided by the Existential Universe Mapper or EUM framework, a bifocal lens that looks at both the individual and the organization. In today's episode, we are diving into a topic that is, well, uncomfortable, often avoided, but always powerful: rage. With me is Sarbari Gomes Dasgupta, an OD practitioner, coach, therapist, and facilitator whose work centers on emotional healing, somatic intelligence, and systemic transformation. Sarbari is also the CEO of Reflexive Lenses Consulting, the organization that houses the EUM framework and tools. Thank you for joining us, Sarbari.
Hey Pratibha, thank you for having me. I feel lovely that I'm here and I have this space with you for our conversation, especially a topic as complex and charged as rage.
So then let's get right to it. Why this topic and why now?
And why not now? Rage is one of the emotions that we've always been taught to repress or suppress. In my work, I have seen explosive, irrational, even dangerous expression of rage also in my life. However, when I work with individuals, whether it is coaching, whether it is therapy, even in the organization OD work, I've come to see rage as a portal, in fact, a gateway to our innermost world that has the possibility to illuminate our deepest wounds, boundaries, and desires. So I chose this topic because I believe rage is a force when held with compassion and care, can lead to healing and transformation. However, one has to recognize it as such. And then the toughest, hold it tenderly, give it space so that it can be seen and be transformed because rage wishes to be seen.
That resonates deeply, especially now in a time where collective rage is surfacing everywhere, from protests to workplace burnout to quiet disillusionment. It feels like something is trying to speak through us, no?
Absolutely, absolutely. Rage is not just personal. It's not about somebody's private life and the experience that people have gone through and therefore rage, but it's also social. We look at what's happening all over the world, systemic and ancestral. We actually carry rage through hereditary family history, community history, society history. And of course, we can either ignore it. Alternately, we can also turn towards it with intention.
Well, even so, a lot of people still confuse rage and anger, right? Are they the same?
Well, they are related, but very different. Anger is often about something that is current. An event has happened, a boundary has been crossed, a violation that should not have happened. So it has a present time quality. Once somebody addresses that, that anger does not linger. All right. But rage, on the other hand, is very, very primal and it's rooted in the past. It's what happens when anger has been suppressed over and over again. Rage, is also both old and young. Young because it connects to our childhood wounds, old because it also carries generational memory. So, if these two things, when anger has been suppressed, expression has been suppressed over and over and over again, either by self or has been experienced as such, whether it is childhood wounds and whether it's a family generational memory of seeing this over and over again, that's when rage is born. And what is really interesting is that more than anger and rage and shame are intertwined.
Remember the interconnection from a recent session that you held between rage and shame. Could you please elaborate this relationship for our listeners?
Yeah, sure. Shame is about the belief that one is fundamentally flawed or unworthy. And when this belief is reinforced through rejection, neglect, systemic oppression like blame, like accusation, or systemic oppression of caste, class, etc., it can ignite a deep, simmering rage. And we see that in our society, right? You see on the road, in the way that sometimes people behave. One would say, why such a huge response to something that is a seemingly small trigger? This morning only, I was talking to someone in my work, and this client, she's only 27 years old. And she was talking about how she holds herself responsible for her father's bypass surgery because before her father's heart attack, she had an altercation with her father. And how her relatives had told her that she was responsible. And although she's a very intelligent person, for her to recognize that heart attack doesn't happen because of an altercation, heart attack has a history 20 years, 25 years, 30 years of body going through changes. And yet, this and all the rage then gets turned inwards. And her thought of herself is she's unworthy, she's not good enough. And so, this shame and this rage often works for her, and it works for all of us because it often gets turned inwards. And also, people, for those who have been taught to suppress strong emotions, like this girl, it gets inward and reinforcing the very shame that sparked it. So I feel ashamed, and because of that shame, I feel rage. And because I feel rage and I have exposed, I feel ashamed again. It's a vicious cycle. And this creates a cyclical trap. The more rage one feels, the more shame surfaces for feeling it. And the more shame one carries, the more rage builds underneath that surface. For instance, when someone is acting out of rage, be it aggression, withdrawal, outburst, yelling, conflict, anything, the next feeling is, how could I have done that? I should not have done that. So the next feeling is that of shame. There's something is wrong with me, of having done something that one should not have done. And this reinforces the dynamic of shame and rage duo. But rage also shows up as depression, chronic illness, passive aggression, perfectionism, even silence. It can be both loud or quiet. It can live in the jaw, the gut, the shoulders, in the back, and it can be inherited. Our bodies remember what our ancestors couldn't express. To untangle this dynamic, one must approach both emotions with compassion, recognizing shame as a wound and rage as its fierce protector, holding a sword, each holding keys to healing and personal truth. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I also realize while I've been focusing on figuring out my relationship with rage, I think this duo is something that I've not worked with, not
Mm.
enough at least.
Mhm.
And a lot of what you said resonated in terms of um, behavioral externalization of rage.
That's right.
Lots to think about.
Yeah,
But what I wanted to focus on is also, and what I found really interesting is how you're suggesting that rage is residing in our bodies.
absolutely. Absolutely. The body doesn't forget. And even if we don't have language for our experiences, our body holds the memory. It's proved right now, right? The cells remember, the body remembers, and that's why somatic work is so powerful when dealing with rage. There are times that we are feeling enraged, and we have gotten used to not expressing it, but our body will tell us there will be headache, there will be, all kinds of physical things, including depression, that the body will tell you that there's something that is raring to go out and you are not seeing it.
That makes perfect sense. It also makes me wonder, though, where does rage really come from?
From all kinds of places. It can stem from personal trauma, abuse, neglect, betrayal, but it also comes from unmet needs. The need for safety, belonging, autonomy, truth. I have a client who's coming to me for managing his anger, and he's a CEO of an organization. And in our conversation, what came up was that he has never ever been asked about what his choice of life ought to be, including his marriage. And he doesn't know what to do with that choicelessness. So, rage also arises from oppression in systems, in societies, racism, casteism, sexism, colonialism, colonization. And interestingly, rage can also show up when we grow and evolve. Because, for instance, if I were to start working with somebody, they will have to let go of long held identities in which they are very, very comfortable. I know this is who I am. How dare you ask me to give this up? Because if I give this up, I don't know who I will be. That kind of psychological loss can also provoke rage.
I think on that note, I'd like to one. I think on that note, I'd like to bring back something you mentioned earlier
Mhm.
about inherited rage. Could you speak
Mhm.
more to that?
Well, intergenerational trauma is absolutely real. If rage is forbidden or punished in your society, and a rage, like I said, is all kinds of things, not just anger. It's about shame, it's about expression, it's about feelings. If expression are forbidden, if talking about, if um, being seen is forbidden, is spoken, being spoken about is forbidden, it just didn't disappear. It just goes underground. So we often carry what previous generations could not process, and we might reenact patterns without ever knowing why. And in my work, I've come across people who are absolutely following the same pattern again and again. And it's only when they get in touch with, is this what my previous generation felt? Is this what my previous generation felt? For instance, one of my clients sitting in Sweden saying, I have to be like my father. I have to look after the family exactly like my father did. And yet, his financial situation, his psychological situation, his marital situation tells him that he needs to not just do that, but also needs to look after his own family today. And the shame that he feels about not being the person that he should have been like his father. But what did the father do? The father looked after other people in the family without looking after the brothers and the sisters. And so now this brother, who is youngest, has grown up saying, nobody else looks after, I must. And he doesn't know what to do with the rage that he experiences, rage of not being heard, rage of not being understood. And he internalizes that towards himself. In fact, when he first came to me, he came to me with suicidal thoughts. He's moved away from that. So suicidal thoughts is also a kind of rage. If you can see that, can you connect that? This is generational process of looking at, like, for instance, looking after others without looking after somebody that needs looking after. And this person is following the same trauma without realizing what he was doing. Does that make sense? So we reenact patterns without even knowing why are we doing that. It's like an emotional file.
It definitely makes a lot of sense. And it almost sounds like we've become emotional archives.
Absolutely. And when we begin with engaging with those emotional archives, we can, if we feel like, choose to break those cycles.
Well, I want to bring back something that I am particularly interested in. It'll be a whole other hour-long conversation. But I definitely at least want to touch the relationship and sexuality strand, the gender and sexuality strand. Could you please shed some light on how gender and sexuality shape our relationship to rage?
I was waiting. When will Pratibha talk about this one? Well, it actually impacts us profoundly. Many women, queer people, and trans people are taught from a young age that rage is unsafe, unattractive, or even immoral. So they internalize it. Rage gets distorted and becomes shame, illness, anxiety. On the other hand, men, directly or indirectly, are often taught that rage is the only way out, that anger is okay, that aggression is okay. And if you look at for the others, women, queer, and trans, and this comes up in my work with professors, academics, lawyers, NGO workers, educationists, leaders in corporate world, the consultants, the language is exactly the same. That rage is unsafe, unattractive, or even immoral. And so in that sense, everyone loses, right? Because men doesn't know how to touch the core part of tenderness. And women and queer and trans people only has to be tender and soft and receiving, and they don't know how to deal with the anger. So instead of being a signal for truth or a call for change, it becomes something harmful or hidden. So reclaiming rage means reclaiming voice, power, and vulnerability, because if we do not reclaim vulnerability, we don't even know what power is. Because reclaiming power without reclaiming vulnerability is actually reclaiming toxic masculinity. So it is true for everyone.
Then, what would engaging with rage in a healthy, transformative way look like?
Well, I think we need to be still, and that's the toughest part, which means we must slow down. Rage is fast, it wants to react. And that's why when we burst out like that. We have to slow the mind and the body to feel what's beneath it. So, regular willful practices like journaling, breath work, yoga, movement, even drawing, where rage lives in your body, brings immense amount of awareness. I would add that even classical music, especially Indian classical music, when practiced, um, actually helps us invigorate the vagus nerve. And if we can listen to that or even practice or voicing, or when I'm using the word breath work, when I use the word yoga, also there are many kinds of pranayams. All of that really help you to be in touch.
I think that's really helpful. I'll keep journaling and maybe breath work and definitely music with me um, as my practices. I'm also wondering these could be ways of individuals to engage with rage. But what about when one encounters rage as, say, therapists, coaches, or even facilitators? What to do then?
We need to be aware, and we have to create safe containers, which means we cannot rush to fix the individual. We are not there to solve the problem. We are there to hold the space, which also means we have to learn to be still. We also have to learn to understand what seems to be happening. We have to learn to be a witness to the emerging drama and the saga of the group's or the person's life. It's not ours to manage, it's ours to create that space. We use silence. We can ask reflective questions like, what does your rage want to protect? Or when you feel ashamed, who exactly is feeling ashamed of? And who's watching the person feeling ashamed? What if your own boundary feels violated? And working with the body is also important. Rage usually, in my experience, and I don't know everything, but usually lives in constricted areas like jaw, chest, gut, neck, abdomen, even hands. And you know what? People are often afraid of their own rage. Normalize that. Rage is not a pathology. It's an it's an inner intelligence which has not been understood. So if you remind them that they have a choice, they can be with rage, which means they can also learn to witness the rage without acting it out. And in order to witness, all the practices that I talked about would be needed. The last thing that I would like to say for the facilitators or coaches or therapists is you need to understand your own shame and rage too.
Hmm. Hmm.
And what is getting triggered and working with that. Only then we will be able to be a witness. If I can't be a witness to myself, I cannot be a witness to others.
You said people are often afraid of their own rage. And even as facilitators or coaches, I feel like that is the fear um, that operates, even though we try to um, witness it in practice. So it seems to be easier said than done. Um,
Absolutely.
there's a concept in yoga that your sharing reminded me of using love to counter rage. But how to really do that is something I'm wondering about.
Well, I usually tell people and tell myself, fake it till you make it. What that means is, as Patanjali has said, cultivate the opposite. When rage arises, invite compassion. In Buddhism, also, the same thing is there. If you can be compassionate towards yourself, if you can be compassionate even when you're feeling really angry, one of the things is to observe that anger. For instance, when I started this practice, I realized my anger looks like an orange thing. It came to me after practicing it over and over again, and I started looking at that orange entity. And that took me to all over the place. That is not the place to talk about this, but to invite compassion and so become counterintuitive, to not suppress the rage, to not blame oneself, but to soften it. Rage doesn't want violence, it just wants the truth. It simply wishes to be seen. When you see it, the intensity comes down. In fact, our framework, EUM or the Existential Universe Mapper, can address this in a very different way because EUM can map some of the important milestones that one has skipped in the process of journeying through one's life. When we journey through our lives, we build values, we build framework, we create frames of references. In this process, there are times when we over engage with something, and there are times when we undervalue or under engage with some process in our lives, some stages of our lives. And that tells us how we relate to authority, how we relate to peers, how we relate to ourselves, how we deal with change. What are some of the fears that we hold? What are some of the absolutistic notions that we hold, which we have never reviewed? All of these can give us a clear map of reach for ourselves. But that may be for another day, Pratibha.
Well, I'd definitely want to learn more about the framework, and I'm sure our listeners would too. And towards the end of the podcast, we leave you with the method to do that. But at the moment, I wanted to go back to what sounded like you saying that rage is trying to protect something sacred.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's just protecting the inner child or protecting a forgotten truth. Something that is really very, very sacred internally. When I use the word sacred, we are all born with, in some sense, intact ego. And then there are wounds that happen. And those wounds give rise to the rage. And just because they are wounds and rage, that doesn't make it impure. It's actually something very pure or a forgotten truth. So when we honor rage, it transforms that wound and that rage into clarity, purpose, and even love and compassion towards ourselves and towards the world. It shows us where we are still hurting. It shows us what is holding us back. It shows us what really matters to us. It calls us back to our inner core, our purest part, our forgotten gifts and our values. And I believe if you are willing to sit with it, not run from it, not explode, rage can become our greatest guide.
Hmm. So before we close, I want to ask if someone is listening and realizing with this conversation that they have unresolved rage, how do they find this guide? Where do they really begin?
Begin with breathing when you're feeling angry. Begin with curiosity. What is it that I feel? Not judgment. Most of the time, when we start with judgment, we've already given shame the place. So notice every time you have a big reaction to something seemingly small compared to that reaction, even if you don't express it. And I find this a whole lot of people holding great amount of judgment, great amount of anger, great amount of resentment to something seemingly small. Why did this happen? Why did that person say that? How dare, etc., etc. These are all rage language. That is rage. Observe it. Breathe into it. Breathe into it means when you're feeling that, just breathe it. Even if it is 5 to 10 seconds of breathing, breathe into it. If you have time, write about it. If you have time and the inclination, draw its location in the body. When I've asked people to draw their location, they have often found the place in the chest, in their hands, in their back, in their abdomen, in their throat, in all kinds of places. If you really wish to work with it, seek support, seek a therapist, a coach, a listening circle, maybe a group of fellow seekers. And most importantly, trust that rage is not your enemy, it's your messenger. It's your guiding light if you wish it to be.
That is absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much for this illuminating conversation, Sarbari. I'm sure it left our listeners with deep insights and lots of reflections. I surely am grateful.
I am honored to be here, Pratibha. Thank you for calling me.
You've been listening to the passionate and insightful OD practitioner, coach and therapist Sarbari Gomes Dasgupta on season 1 of Riddlers, a podcast by Reflexive Lenses. If this conversation resonated with you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Write to us at pratibha@eumlens.in and share what it stirred in you.